Hey, Colin from Video Revealed here. I thought I'd just throw in an extra episode about my life as a retoucher, and I've got some interesting stories. Well, let's go back to the mid 1990s when I was using a Mac back then, and that Macintosh cost $19,000. And a big part of that cost was the memory. 100 megabytes of RAM was $6,000. And that scanner that's off just in the corner there, that was a $3,500 Arca scanner. And I was asked to join a retoucher who was an airbrush artist. His name was Mike, and he had a company for years, and he was airbrushing. So he was an artist, and he could paint photorealistic illustrations and retouch everything with paint. And he had a whole painting studio in his house. We partnered up. I took out a loan, bought this computer, another one for home for my wife to do the books, and took it down to his house in Scarborough, Ontario, and we worked together. He was the art guy. He went to art school. Me, I was the computer guy. And I didn't go to computer school because there was nothing at that time. It was all about making this up as you go. There was no books, there was no YouTube, there were no tutorials, no internet. You had to figure this stuff out on your own. So I started putting together ideas of how to make this stuff, and I'll go through a lot of these projects and show you. But here's what you're dealing with back then. Photoshop 2.5, no layers, one undo, that's it. So you had to save selections, alpha channels, and typically you'd open up a document that would have anywhere from 5 to 30 alpha channels, so you could redo a selection and paint in the selection. And I took a lot of what Mike did with airbrushing, like working with Friscuits, which were masks, and then converting them over to to do that with selections to recreate the working with a Friscuit. And we all used Wacom tablets back then. You did not paint with a mouse. It was absolutely essential. But the other thing that we were doing is we were competing with other companies that were doing stuff digitally. And they did this on huge systems called Quantel paint boxes. They were so big that the computer was in a refrigerated room next door. They had a large screen monitor, which you didn't see anywhere, and they could open up, 200-300 megabyte files in real time. And we were competing with them, and that was $1 million system. And here we were on our Macs, and people were saying, you can't do this work on a personal computer. Well, we did. So my my third day on the job, I printed this out and was very proud of this. This was an illustration for a laundry detergent product, and I wish I would have kept the box. But there was a shirt and there was a handkerchief, and they were kind of blowing on a clothesline, and they had a real earthy kind of homey look to them, and they were supposed to look like illustrations. And I was very happy that this thing made it on the final box, and I thought, not bad for somebody who didn't go to art school. And I didn't have digital copies of a lot of the stuff. There was no storage online. There was no Dropbox. SideQuest cartridges cost a ton of money, and they saved 45 megabytes of room. There's no USB back then. Okay, so here is one of the first jobs we did, and we would, in this particular job, we got a photo of this guy, and then a photograph of the family. And the job was to close cut him, so cut out the background, place him on a new gradient background, and then draw in the shape of the shadow coming off of him. It's as if he's phoning his family. And that might seem, pretty simple in today's Photoshop world. No undos, one undo, no layers. And we had to do that. We were also dealing with newspaper. So you had to be within certain tolerances to print so that it wouldn't gum up the newspaper printing. It couldn't be too dark and it couldn't be too light, because the ratio that you hit it at, if you got it too light, it would just turn to white. If it's too dark, it would turn to black. And printing on newspaper in the mid 1990s sucked. Even local newspapers print so much better. But what made this job even scarier was when we delivered the job, it was about 2 hours before press time, before it had to go on press. And that's when everything was set up. So we showed up with the customer, they loaded it up, and they wanted a change. Now, if this was my computer, back at the studio, I would have selections. No selections. They wanted something manipulated in the shadow. So in front of about a half a dozen people in their studio on their computer with my file flattened, I had to, with all these eyes watching me, make these changes, paint in edges, and make it work, get it on the disc so that it would print. Because if they missed the run, they would miss the ad and the heads would roll. Very scary day, but I triumphed on that one. Okay, and then another one, the same kind of campaign. She's calling a tow truck, and instead of the car shadow, it's a tow truck. So they gave us a tow truck, they gave us her, have to close cut her, had to make the shadow, had to draw the shadow, had to make a selection around her, paste, and then do the inverse of her, and then paste that in. Oh. And where this would really kill you in Photoshop is edges. If edges were wrong, you had to go in and paint in little bits. And there was also a lot of dodging and burning back then, highlighting areas in here. There was no digital cameras, so all of these photographs are photographed on traditional cameras, then they're scanned, and then they're sent to us. Again, another one, she's calling the office, and we had to make that shadow shape. Now this one, which I also have open in Photoshop here, this is an Apple ad. Here's my silent partner. So a little story about the guy having a dog. Interesting story about this dog is the dog handler came in and had a couple of thoroughbred dogs, they're looking perfect and beautiful, but they weren't behaving, and he's trying to control them. They're trying to photograph them, and it didn't land. Well, he was taking care of this dog, which this eye was actually, I don't know if it had a sickness or whatever, but this eye didn't look very photographic at all. It was white and it had problems in it. He was taking care of this dog, and all it would do is this. It would just go sit in the corner. And the customer kept looking at the dogs he brought, then looking at that dog, said, why don't we use that dog? So they shot that dog, gave it to me. I popped one eye off, moved the eye over, and had to obviously rotate it in, make it look slightly different, and drop it in, and you could never tell. So that's the job of a retoucher, is nobody knows you did anything. It just happened. It was shot that way. Oh boy, this is the Newton. If you remember the Apple Newton back in the day. So here we had to close cut that, drop in a shadow, create this jagged effect, and tweak this a little bit. There would have been a lot of dodging and burning in this one too. They give us a shot of just the woman. They give us a shot of all of these frames, which is supposed to look like photos dropped on a table. And then it was a matter of taking her and placing her in all of those. This, I believe, by the time we're into here, this was a Photoshop with layers, so it would be much easier. But again, tons of dodging and burning around in the eye to make the eye pop out. And another one, close cut this guy, make sure he prints properly, the darks aren't too dark, the lights aren't too light. And another one. We had trouble in here with the masking because, as you can see, it's really, really soft on the edges. So it was a matter of blurring that a little bit more. And with these kinds of jobs, you're working close with the creative director or the art director, and a lot of times they're looking over your shoulder and you're painting this away. Oh, and all of this stuff, by the way, was when my partnership with Mike frazzled. After a year together, we split ways, and then I started working for BBDO, which is even today one of the largest ad agencies in the world. Oh boy, yeah, so this one, they gave us an archive, so this is back with Mike. They gave us an archive photo with 3 babies and they wanted 5 babies. So take 2 babies, slide them behind, move these down as if they're coming closer, the 3 babies in the front, so we could have room for their heads, and then tweak their faces a little bit. No liquefy at that time, so you're either painting or copying, pulling up a selection and then distorting it, and then it flattens back. No layers on that. Jobs like this were really, really tough because the footage or the images we got weren't the best. This little inset shot had tons of noise in it, and you can almost see it looks painterly, and that's with me working with the art director, and he's saying, you know, lighter here, darker there, and the same with the goal. This was a nightmare job. First of all, it was a grainy shot. So anytime you're fixing or adding something that has a lot of grain, you have to account for that. You have to make all of your edits look like they weren't there, so you're recreating the grain in your edits. And every single one of these signs in the back had ads on them, advertising, and I had to take all of that off. It was a nightmare. That was a tough job. This one is a compilation of a ton of things. So they gave us the beer and the glove, and we had to make it look transparent. We had to make the beer look transparent, and all this had to be close cut. So when they give it to us, it's a flattened scan. We've got to close cut the faces, bulge them inside the light bulbs, and again, a lot of dodging and burning, and then each one of the corners with the caps in it. All right, so now we're starting to get to the world of Bell, and this is when I was at BBDO, and Bell was fighting for customers. So their big thing was, it's like roughly the number of people who switched back to Bell, and there weren't enough cars. This is the Gardner Expressway in Toronto, and they would bring me the shot, and they would tell me, we need more cars. Whew. So if a car, this is in perspective, so if there's a car here and it's going around the corner, how do you copy that car and then turn it around the corner? So I'm taking the sides of cars and distorting it. I'm moving the backs of cars and painting it in. And I can't remember how many but I added a ton of cars. Again, lots of grain. Make sure that the areas still have that grain in it. This is one of the worst jobs I ever had to work on, ever, because the art director and I did not work well together. She did not have any faith in me whatsoever. So with this kind of a job, I had to put the juicy fruit things on their fingers. It wasn't there, so I had to put those on. I had to remove the sky from the top one and look at all of the trees that I had to cut around. The bottom one was the tough one. The top one wasn't that hard. The bottom one, I was given the horizon, I was given the pyramids, I was given the guy on the camel, and then sand in the front and sand in the back, and then the guys, and then the juicy fruit. And I had to put all of this together. And we got into a bit of a tussle because she didn't think the horizon looked correct, as if every horizon in around the world looks one way. It doesn't. There are so many factors involved in what a horizon can look like. It can look sharp and crisp, or it can look soft depending on light, depending on what's between you and that. Anyway, finally got the last one done, but she no like me. This one I'm really proud of, and I did get a printout of a lot of these here, and this one is I'm really proud of it, because what they wanted to do is they wanted to feature this in an upcoming, I think it was advertisement first appeared in McLean's. So this was a 1957 ad, and I think this was for a car show and or an ad, but all they had was a printout of this with stains and rips on it. And the car was, you know, a third of this was ripped and stained, and they didn't even know if it could be fixed. So they brought it into me, and I had a look at it. And obviously this is an illustration, this is not a photograph, which gave me some leeway. Photographs have tons more gradients in them and natural things and reflections. An illustration has a minimal of photorealistic stuff in it, especially in 57 around this time. But I zoomed in on these areas, made little selections, and carefully painted by hand over and over and over and over again. Finally, they loved it. They loved it. They couldn't believe it, that it could be fixed. So I'm very proud of that one. Oi, this one, oh my God, what a job. So the idea here, this is for the Toronto Library, and the library's whole idea, their logo or their motto or whatever, is a question mark. Obviously get your questions answered at the library. So they wanted this iconic shot of the CN Tower in Toronto, but they wanted it in a question mark. The problem is you have to extend how long the tower is before you twist it around. It's not a matter of just taking the CN Tower and twisting it, as we found. If you do that, the question mark is very, very small. So we had to stretch the tower first and then drag it around. No liquefy. We did use a third-party tool, which was notoriously hard to render. It took forever. And it was from a company called Human Software. I think it was called Squiz. And you had to, it was kind of like liquefy, but you could do something like that and liquefy in probably 10 minutes. But that's probably a half a day's work. All right, so now we get into these FedEx ads. And everything about FedEx is everyone wants a little extra. So they want Dizzy Gillespie, but his cheeks, if you know Dizzy, he played with big puffy cheeks. He did recirculating breathing. Recirculating breathing meant he could play, almost like a bagpipe, he could play and recirculate his breath and keep the trumpet playing longer than you would normally run out of air. Anyway, we had to come in here and then puff that up. Remember, there was minimal effects. There was a bulge effect, I think, but we still had a lot of work. And then the edges, we had to make the edge look natural and this kind of a grungy look. This guy, they wanted this handwritten stuff, and they actually looked at my handwriting, so I just wrote all this stuff out, scanned it back in, and then converted it, and lots of dodging and burning on that. Minimal work on here, but some pretty famous people. So for this, they gave us the Moosehead Dry beer caps, and they were scanned in. So then we had to, this was not done in 3D, this was all done in Photoshop 2D. We had to place the caps on there because they shot them kind of in perspective. So we had to tweak them a little bit. One fit that one under his bum, and then make them look a little bit different so they weren't all perfect. One of the first 3D jobs I did, Mike would normally have illustrated this, so he would have painted the whole thing from scratch, but it was much easier for something like this to be made in 3D. And the program I used was, before Maya, Alias, before Alias was bought by Autodesk, Alias had a program called Sketch, and it was one of the most advanced 3D programs at that time. It used NURBS before Maya, and I created this look that they wanted with, and the depth of field wasn't part of it. So you couldn't render with depth of field at that time. So we faked that in by blurring that in. Here's another 3D job. Again, he would have illustrated this, but I cranked this out in no time with the shape and then each one of the Scrabble pieces really quick. This was an interesting one I did for BBDO, where they wanted to create these cards and make them look like they were raised up, like they were embossed. There were no style effects in Photoshop at that time. All of that had to be done, and layers, we had layers then, but I had to blur and offset things. If you remember chops, channel operations, if you go back to that time in Photoshop, it was a real challenge. But I got this raised up look to look like they were cards. Another one with restoration where we had to clean this up. This was an old archive shot, dirty, ripped, stained, and we had to fix this. This is the Skylon Tower at Niagara Falls. Here's another Niagara Falls shot, and you can see it extends out on both sides. And a huge job for retouchers is extending the background. They didn't have enough. They thought with the ad the way that they want it, they need more room. They're putting type in here, and the design and layout needs more. So you paint it in. Now, if you think cloning is easy, it ain't. Well, crappy cloning is easy, but really good, undetectable cloning takes a lot of work. This one, I think this is the only one I have that's a before and after. I think they only had her, but didn't have a license to use her, so I had to take everything else and then stick her in the background and put the lines on so that it looked like television. This was done with multiple shots, obviously, but they shot the inside of the car dark so the lights would show up, and then light so she and the rest would show up. So we had to composite both of those together. This is Photoshop, no layers. And then put the background in, the glow and the blue background. Okay, this was an interesting job. This was when the Blue Jays won the World Series, and this guy was originally photographed with somebody beside him. So I had to very carefully go in here and mask all of this out, get rid of the guy, and then create these curtains in the background, and this ran in the Toronto Star. This one caused a lot of controversy and was pulled. This woman, you're probably familiar with seeing women who put these rings on their necks and it raises them up. Again, this is like the dizzy one. Everyone wants extra, so they wanted more rings. So I had to pop her head off, move her head up, add more rings, and then fill in the background. So all of that, because if I didn't, there would be a little chopped area. People complained about this and oppression of women, so this ad was pulled. Another one, this one's fairly simple. Still took a little bit of work. I was given one of the magnifying glasses and 3 of the maps, and I had to enlarge the map and then crop the map into that area, add some shadows in there. Another fairly easy one where they wanted the motorcycle to go through all of the sides of the van. A lot of blurring and painting and stuff. Okay, now this one I think is really interesting. Before I became a photo retoucher, I was an Illustrator guy. An Illustrator is all about precision and accuracy, especially in package design, up to 3 decimal points of accuracy, and that's what I was based on. But Mike was really about his hand what he could paint by his hand. So we designed this, well, they gave us the design. We had to recreate this idea of the car blowing through the manuscript and then the notes flying around. And what they wanted was the notes to have a motion blur on them. They're not moving. Motion blur didn't work in Photoshop directionally like this, so you couldn't go around a corner. So I was doing a lot of this as precise and mathematical as like with settings, with a blur setting and just a bunch of math. But I couldn't get some of them a certain way, and I was amazed when Mike said, let me take a shot at it, and he just grabbed the Wacom tablet, zoomed all the way in, and then was hand painting the motion blurs on there. Pretty amazing stuff. This ended up being about an 8-foot backlit thing. It was beautiful. Okay, Here's some more FedEx. In this example, you've probably seen Swamis on beds of nails, and they're a bed, so they're much longer, but this is a portrait shot, so they didn't have enough room, so I had to chop that and move it over so it fit within that, and then again create that ragged outside edge. All right, imagine opening up your newspaper and seeing something like this. This is a 2-page tabloid newspaper ad, and I had to make every one of these, and I made them in Illustrator. And if you look closely, you will not see any repeating in here, because I was very meticulous in how, well, there might be some repeating if you zoomed in, but the idea was this. This is again back to Bell. How many people switched to Bell? Funny story, a customer complained, a viewer or a reader of the newspaper complained, and they said that this was not accurate. How do they know how many lines are in there? They're wrong. Well, because I made this in Adobe Illustrator, and because each one of those shapes is an object, Illustrator can count every one of those shapes accurately and instantly. So when the art director came and they said, you know, we've got a problem, nobody wants to sit here and count those. I said, hold on. Open, click, document, statistics, objects, boom. There's your number right there. Take a screenshot and you can send that away. Done, finished, over. Okay. I was given one skull and some smoke. The smoke was shot against black so I could composite it with screen, and then a cigar, and then, you know, the background and things like that. All right, so this guy, he opens up, so that's how it starts. And again, it's like a large format, so everyone needs a little extra, and then it opens up to FedEx. So again, they wanted him to be bigger. So he wasn't big. This is already a very famous sumo wrestler, but they wanted him even larger. So whatever it was, he's got to be like 30% even bigger. And then do it in such a way that it could be cut, and then do that ragged edge. Here's another 3D model this was for an All-Star Cup. This trophy didn't exist. I can see that it's illustrated now, but I would do a better job today. But this was probably done in Form Z, and I created the whole thing, the boards in the back, and blurred those out, the ice, and the whole thing. Shadows, boy oh boy, shadows under vehicles. The first job I ever did with Mike was creating shadows, and the shadows you see in like car ads, and if you go to a car dealership and there's cars and you see a shadow, that shadow is supposed to be black, not cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And we would have to close cut the car and then paint the shadow in. And we could paint the shadows, no problem, no layers, but we could still do it. The problem was, if you hit the D key on Photoshop and default the colors, you don't get black shadows, you get cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, called rich black. And you can't see it unless you go to the channels. I didn't even think of that, but we sent the whole lot of these back, and it was probably like 15, 20 cars, and we got a complaint from the printer, make these shadows black. And I realized it was my fault. So we had to go and highlight that area, and we couldn't just delete the cyan, magenta, yellow because the black would be too weak, so we had to remake all of those shadows, no layers, one undo. All right, I am also very proud of this one. Holt Renfrew is a very high-end store in Toronto, and it has this very high-end magazine, and the ad was right there on that first page. The ad was for a company called Absolute Vodka, and they had a campaign that was so cool is they would use their name, Absolute, as in the Absolute, and then fill in the blank, whatever it was. And in this one, it was pinstripe because it's Holt Renfrew pinstripe suits, dapper men. And we had to create this, so I made the bottle based off measurements in Sketch, Alias Sketch, and then had to do the printing as if it was done in chalk. And then if you look at, there's a little thread hanging off of there. Again, that was the brilliance of Mike with the Wacom tablet, painting by hand a little thread. The shadow in the back went through probably 10 iterations because they wanted the HR, the Holt Renfrew, in the shadow, and you couldn't do that without faking it. I mean, you see the top of that is white and the bottom is, so I never liked the shadow part. That was them. That was designed by committee. But I think the bottle itself looks incredible. Another example of an illustration. So they wanted that pure white, or sorry, pure yellow, add the shadow. And here's the final thing that I wanted to end with. And both Mike and I were really proud of this. I don't have the funny story with this one. The original shot had a guy looking like another construction worker's head was on the other side of the tub, and it kind of looked creepy. Like here's the guy in a tub and another guy's looking over in the tub, so we had to remove him and fill in the background. But here's the idea, and you have to think back to how much memory computers had. Look at how large this is printed. Back then, people were printing stuff, this size on Macs, which, by the way, this was printed on a 3M printer, which was $35,000, and an inkjet today does better. But to get to this level, you had to have giant Photoshop files, and they would take 20 minutes to save. 20 freaking minutes. And that's not even copying it. Then you'd have to copy it to the disk, call the taxi, and have it shipped out. But we worked with Kodak. That was it. This is when Kodak was still rocking the house. And Kodak had an output bureau in Toronto. And they would do billboards. Well, you think of how big a billboard is. A billboard's huge. You're not going to load a billboard into Photoshop, not even today. But back then it was a photographic process. It was all optical, the way that they would transfer things to final printing, from camera shots to final output to sticking it on a billboard. And they already had a system for working photographically. Again, going back to this $1 million Quantel paint box, they would deliver a file, and we found that the minimum file size was 200 megabytes. So if you could deliver a 200 megabyte, 8-inch by 10-inch file at 300 pixels per inch, actually I think it was more than that, but it was less about pixels per inch and it was more about megabytes, how big, how much information in it. So they would print an 8x10 transparency called a tranny back then, an 8x10 tranny, and then they would send that off to the customer and you could print a billboard. So we found that as long as we could make a 200 megabyte file in Photoshop, we could print it on anything. And that opened up huge markets for us, that we could do anything. So here was one of the first examples of me standing beside a bus ad. I don't have the other one when I was at BBDO. Oh yeah, these guys, they ended up being on the side of a bus. So they printed out on the side of a whole bus. So you think of how big a bus is. It's almost the size of a billboard. But each one of these was out on a bus, and that was pretty cool. Then we beat the paint box guys in their own game, and they had $1 million system, so they had huge overhead. We just had the two of us, and then later me over at BBDO. So it was what I did before I was hired at Adobe. They hired me because I had this background, but there was no books on how to do this stuff. I was inventing processes, how to make and combine and move and keep, the quality good. It was fun when it worked. It was awful when things blew up or didn't work. And that usually had to do with storage or time or, trying to get stuff saved and just, it was, if you go back to Photoshop and you remember the screen going from top to bottom. So if you zoomed in Photoshop like that, you wouldn't, by the way, it wouldn't go whoop. It would zoom in and you would see the screen go and on a fast computer, that would take at least 10 seconds just to see the zoom in. Now you zoom out, 10 seconds, zoom out, oh man. It was unbelievably slow. Now you're doing stuff much faster. Our phones take higher quality images. We've got gigabytes and terabytes, all for the better. But it was quite a ride, quite interesting. I had a lot of fun. Hopefully you had a lot of fun listening to my stories about how things used to be. But it was crazy, and I really appreciate the speed and power of computing today. Thanks for listening.